Yes. I want to start with just sharing a little bit about myself. For the last couple of years, I've been working on bringing the Buurtzorg model to the UK. Clearly, I'm going to tell you more about Buurtzorg in a minute. But it's been an interesting learning curve, and I can tell you that there are some interesting lessons that I'm sure you'll find of use. Before that, I worked predominantly with social enterprises and tried to help the public sector to become more entrepreneurial through an employee-owned model. It's got great overlap also with giving people on the front line more ownership for their product and their service in order to create more entrepreneurship and therefore better services and better products. So there's clearly a link there. Further down in my career history, I actually was a banker in the city, but we quickly forget about that and move on. What I would like to do is also ask a little bit about yourself. And for that, we have some polls lined up. We will have several polls throughout today, throughout this session, to make sure that you stay awake, so that we can get your views and to help you ask and highlight some of the questions that you may have. But we also have plenty of opportunities to ask questions either through the chat, or when we feel that might work better, we might actually bring you in to ask your question in person. Before we go on with the polls though, very briefly, what are we going to be talking about? Well, clearly we're going to be talking about self-managing organizations and some of the concepts that these organizations use, how it works and why they have embarked on this road. And we will explore together, the downsides and the upsides of working in this way. Then I want to share with you some of the lessons that I've learned by working with organizations that try to adopt some of these principles. And again, we can explore this together and answer some of your questions in this regard. And then I would quite like to wrap up with giving you some hints and tips for how to make the start yourself if you're so inclined, and making you an offering of support along the lines of that. So that's today's program. Plenty to get on with. I can talk about this subject for hours and hours. So I have to go through this in great big strides, and Louise will make sure that I keep an eye on the clock. So apologies if it sometimes goes at a high pace, but we can always. I will send you the materials afterwards, or rather Louise will, and I will also send you a reading list if you want to read up further on some of these topics. So without further ado, let's dive into some of the polls. Louise, can you fire off the first poll, please? So just to get a feel for who's in the audience, what's the size of your organization? If you can quickly just tick the appropriate answer, it gives everybody a little bit of an idea of the likely complexity.
Completing it. It's quite a good spread. Oh, nearly there. Okay, I will just share that so you can see it.
Great, so we have some very sizable organizations, we have a good mid-range, and we have some startups and early scale-ups, I think, as well here. So that's, well, I suppose it represents Cambridge perfectly, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. Although I guess that size is a proxy for hierarchy and to what extent your organization is rather bureaucratic. Let's just ask that question. How hierarchical, how bureaucratic do you feel your organization is? Very unscientific poll, but Louise, if you can fire that one off, thank you.
They're completing it. Interesting. Nearly there. Okay, I think. Have you all voted? Pretty much voted now. Okay, I'm going to end that one and share it. There you go.
Oh, look at that. Okay, great. Well, we see some skewing towards the not so or reasonably hierarchical organizations. Not so extremely bureaucratic, which is great news and probably a good starting point for some of the points that we're going to be addressing today. Great, thank you, Louise, and thank you everybody for participating. Let's move on quickly to the body of my presentation. If I can move this on, bear with me. Yep. So when you think about organizations, there's actually an underlying view of how you view humanity, really, how people can be seen. And this is quite a nice metaphor, the metaphor of the traffic light versus the roundabout. And those of you who are really based in Cambridge will recognize some of these scenes, perhaps. There's a brand new Dutch-inspired roundabout on your right-hand side that has made Cambridge a little bit famous. Anyway, the traffic light metaphor is really about how do you solve a problem like crossing the street, assuming that people cannot be trusted to do the right thing. So we have to tell them what to do and when. Complex problems like crossing the street, which in itself is not hugely complex, needs rules, needs technology, and we need a plan for every scenario. And clearly, if sometimes the scenarios or the traffic light doesn't work well, clearly we haven't thought of every scenario, so we need to add more scenarios. The simple rule of thumb there is, traffic lights treat people like children. They need to be told what to do, and they leave their brain at home. Whereas a roundabout is much more based on the idea that people can be trusted, and they can trust each other to use judgment and to work on the back of a couple of very simple rules and create a situation that actually can handle great levels of complexity. Many scenarios might actually unfold, but these simple principles and the trust between the participants will actually result in finding solutions. And actually, if you put a one-liner on that, it's about treating people like adults, like grown-ups, and not leaving your brain at home. Now, funnily enough, we see, of course, a lot more traffic lights in the country than roundabouts. And we also see a lot more traffic light-based organizations than roundabout organizations. And you guess where I'm going with this. We're going towards the fact that actually most organizations have been built on principles of not trusting people's judgment, and people essentially needing a set of rules, regulations, policies and procedures, and people to oversee them in order to get to the right results. And why is that? Well, how did we get here? Well, essentially the history of how we organize work is, of course, very, very old indeed, since the beginning of time, but really took its stride since the Industrial Revolution and subsequent the introduction of scientific management. Taylor, some of you I'm sure are familiar with Taylor's work, introduced the principle that there is the division of labor that will result in the most efficient way of creating a product, building a product, and doing it also in the cheapest possible way. And that has resulted in fantastically high quality products and services over the years, and fantastically successful organizations. So no wonder that the scientific model of hierarchies, of policies and procedures, of command and control, and of workers doing the work and managers doing the thinking, is a model that we're all familiar with and has been the basis of most of our organizations going forward. But of course, in the last 30 to 50 years or so, our society and our world is changing. It's changing in the sense that it's becoming increasingly complex. We're dealing less with predictable yet complicated problems, such as how to build a car, and we're increasingly dealing with much more complex human-based contexts that require different solutions. So also, our workforce is increasingly well educated, which means that they can ultimately make much more decisions themselves. And that means that, or it explains that over the last couple of decades, a different type of organization has become, has emerged. Organizations that are a lot more built on purpose, on empowerment, and on values. And now with the advent also of new technology, have realized in a rethinking of how work could or should be organized. And this is where we're heading now. This is obviously the basis of some of what we're talking about today. On top of that, we had this crisis, I'm sure everyone has noticed. But also, we have seen a new generation of people coming through. Like I said, and to be honest, I count myself amongst those people, that we want to work increasingly, not just 9 to 5 to earn a living and to bring home the bacon, but we want to work to make a difference. We want to have a purpose. And on top of that, so that already has shown that there is a new generation of people coming through who demands work to be organized in a different way. Secondly, we see the advent of modern technology, and we're benefiting from it here and now, that allows work to be structured in a very different manner. We don't have to sit in the same building to do our work. We can do it from anywhere and everywhere. And thirdly, as we have now seen with COVID, is that we're almost forced to learn that lesson. We see that there are limitations to the old-fashioned way of organizing our work, where managers are much more handing out the tasks to their workforce, and therefore we see that there are limitations to that model, and we're looking for new models to manage our dispersed workforce. How do you make sure that people do the right thing, whatever the right thing is, if they're working from home and you can't see them 8 hours a day? Well, maybe that isn't such a problem, but for a lot of organizations, that's a bit of a confrontational issue. So that leads us to the concept of self-managing organizations, I think, or at least it's worth looking at those organizations to see if they offer some solutions to that, because some of these organizations have been around for a little while. So what I propose we do is we look at two. I have lined up Netflix, and I want to spend a little bit of time on that, and then I will tell you a little bit more about Buurtzorg. So Netflix, I've chosen because everybody knows Netflix, clearly. If you weren't already a subscriber before COVID, I'm sure you are now. And Netflix is, of course, a hugely exciting organization in the sense that it's become very, very successful in a relatively short space of time. But it's built on on top of some very different assumptions to how work can be organized than your average organization. And that stems from essentially two seeds that spawned this for Netflix and for the Netflix founder, Reed Hastings. One was that actually he was very successful in a previous company called Pure Software. But he felt that as that company was growing, that when they adopted the traditional way of organizing work, they built their hierarchical pyramid, they introduced more policies and procedures. He just realized that at the same time they were doing this, that innovation and nimbleness was seeping away and was disappearing from the organization. He noticed that this increasingly rigid framework that the company was developing meant that the kind of personnel that attracted was the personnel that was comfortable in working in such an environment, whereas the mavericks, the creators, the innovators were increasingly uncomfortable and left the company. So when he sold Pure Software and he started thinking about setting up a new company, he vowed that he wanted to create this new organization on the basis where innovation was going to be encouraged, and that where rules and regulation, which ultimately in a tailoring approach of efficiency are less important than innovation. That was one important pillar. The other important pillar underneath his approach was the fact that actually he had in his personal life quite a significant event. His marriage went almost down the drain. He and his wife went for marriage counseling, as you do. And he learned throughout that process that trust and openness and frank feedback are absolutely essential for problem solving and allowing people to move on. So he felt that, okay, this openness and this transparency and feedback needs to be part of how I build my new organization. So that's when he started Netflix, initially as a DVD mail order company, but always with in the back of his mind that he wanted to create this streaming service. When he started Netflix, he started with building a great team and introducing this culture of openness and transparency and feedback. And that's not just by telling people to be open, of course. Top down telling someone to be open or to be creative is unlikely to be successful. So he also made a great case for displaying himself, his openness to feedback, and he introduced a model in how that's best done. And he also paired this with the element of trust. So when you give frank feedback, you can really only do this in a safe environment, making sure that you don't get blamed for it. You're just sharing, for instance, but actually that you take the learning from it as an organization. And it's important that the organization replicates that with showing that trust also to the employees. And he started doing that by releasing controls on the expense claims process, very basic, very simple. Basically saying, okay, we trust you. We're going to replace the policy on expenses by a one-liner, act in Netflix's best interest. And for the rest, we trust you to do the right thing. And secondly, he also introduced release controls on holidays. So he allowed people to really just decide for themselves how long holiday they wanted to take and when, as long as obviously they communicated it with their colleagues and made sure that it all fits in operationally. And these foundations really started this positive vibe that encouraged innovation, and that led Netflix to take a second and third step, which was increasingly built on those pillars of openness and trust, or freedom and responsibility, as they sometimes also call it. So that means that they open their books, for instance, they share their strategic thinking, even at a very early stage with all their employees, so that employees understand the context. They allow frontline staff to make fantastically big bets on the decisions that they make, and provide the context in which they trust that those employees make those decisions. And if sometimes those decisions turn out to be not the right ones in hindsight, you're encouraged to take the learning from it, but no heads get chopped off, and you'll understand why that is. You know, if you want to encourage people to take some risk, then the last thing you want to do is chop their heads off when they get it wrong. And Netflix have really taken this to a limit that for some organizations or for some countries might be even slightly uncomfortable in terms of how feedback is really open. But also how they keep driving for getting the best workforce and the best people on their teams. But it has resulted in this fantastically creative organization that, as we know, has been super successful. Now, if Netflix is on a scale of self-management, if there was such a scale, if it's a 7 out of 10, our next example is probably a 9 or a 9.5. Because Buurtzorg, which by the way stands for community care, as you may have picked up, I am Dutch, and it was probably the main reason why I was hired for the job. At least I could pronounce the word Buurtzorg. So Buurtzorg means community care. It's an organization that nowadays consists of about 10,000 nurses, about 4,000 domestic care workers, but it only has one manager. So how do they do it? And why is it such an attractive model? Well, Buurtzorg have demonstrated first and foremost, and has attracted so much attention, not because of not only because of its wacky organizational model, but also because of its outcomes. Buurtzorg have shown that actually, if you deliver community care in the way that they see as the right way, you get better clinical outcomes, you get happier patients, you get a much happier workforce, and also you can do this much more cheaply than traditional ways of delivering care. So clearly this attracted a lot of attention from all over the world, and many organizations have tried to learn from it. Now, how does it work? So we have, in Buurtzorg, you have about 900 teams of nurses They all are responsible for a relatively small locality and embed themselves in that community. And those small teams of nurses, they have great freedoms to operate. And essentially, Buurtzorg gives them the freedom to do and to make the decisions about everything that helps them deliver better care. So that means that a team like that, which is never bigger than 12 people, a team like that looks after about 40 to 80 patients. They choose their own office, they hire their own colleagues, they do their own performance appraisals, they decide how to organize their work, how to do their planning. They're constantly, they establish their own relationships with the local GPs and the hospital, etc., etc. And that has turned out to be the pillar underneath this successful organization. Now, without managers and leaving those teams to self-manage, of course, it raises questions about how do you organize some of the things that normally managers do. How do you deal with perhaps when there is a conflict in the team, or how do you make decisions in such a team? And partly that's organized by giving these teams some training and tools in which they do that. And partly that's organized through the support they can call upon from a range of coaches. There are 20 coaches for the entire organization. So coaches, there are about, every coach looks after about 50 teams. And coaches help these teams work through some of the issues that perhaps are particularly tricky. But a coach will never sit on the seat of the manager. The team still decides. The team is responsible for delivering the performance that is asked of them. The team also agrees with each other how to work and how to divide certain roles. There are certain roles that clearly are very important for a manager, that a manager in a normal organization performs, such as interacting with other parts of the organization, or maybe looking after the finance side, or making sure that learning and development is encouraged. And these roles are divided throughout the teams and rotated on a regular basis. Now, with a lot of these responsibilities delegated to the team, it means that the hierarchy, well, there's no need for a hierarchy, essentially, in the view of Buurtzorg. There is, of course, a need to also help these teams with certain things that would not help them deliver better care, but would actually distract them from delivering better care. For instance, if they find their new office, it is the back office that helps them sort out the lease and take care of the payments of that and all the rest of it. If they hire a new member of staff, it is the back office that will do the reference checks and will do the paperwork and things like that. And the back office in Buurtzorg, therefore, is extraordinarily small. It's only 50 people for an organization, like I said, of 14,000. And they have really fine-tuned it to keep it as simple and small as possible. And that's therefore one of the key learnings or one of the other key learnings of the Buurtzorg model.
Paul, we've got a question actually that sort of fits in with this. It's from Sasha saying, how do you maintain a commonly agreed direction or vision for the business?
You mean for Buurtzorg?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a very good question. What's interesting to note is that the Buurtzorg organizational model that so far I've talked about is really based on their view of what good care looks like. So they have a very strong vision of the care model that really works. And the care model in the Netherlands and also in the UK is essentially very tailored. It is based on the idea that one home care worker comes in and does a little bit of home care work, help someone get up in the morning, perhaps help give a shower, get dressed, but then a nurse comes in and does some of the nursing, then perhaps a physio comes in and does some of the physio work, etc., etc. So a patient would see 3, 4, 5 different people on a daily basis, and a different set of 3, 4, 5 people on the next day and the next day, etc. Whereas Buurtzorg believed that actually good care is about helping patients to regain or retain their independence as much as possible and finding support solutions that support the whole needs of that individual. And for that, you need to have good relationships between care professional and patient, And that means that actually you should really work in small teams where a care professional looks after the whole range of care needs of the patient and works with that patient to find creative solutions, working also with, for instance, the partner of the patient or children or the neighbors or maybe some local voluntary organizations to find solutions that really are sustainable and work much better for the individual concerned. So that vision of care lies at the center of how Buurtzorg is organized. And once you have those principles and that vision in place and part of your DNA, it becomes clear why this organizational model is the right model for such an organization. I hope that answers the question. Okay, we are already flying through the time. I was of course, aware that was going to happen. But let's open up some more questions and answers. I think this is the right time to for me to be challenged on some of this.
Right. Would you like me to launch our poll?
Well, if there are more questions, let's have a few questions first, and then we do the poll.
Sasha says, thank you, work from the customer, in inverted commas. Kate Atkin comments also about, there's a book by Frederick Laloux, Reinventing Organisations, which gives a good overview of Buurtzorg's, excuse my pronunciation, approach, as well as other examples. Do you know this book? What else we got? Tama has commented, partly to Sasha, some companies also develop values books or pamphlets for their new hires and existing employees. They make it part of their branding, positioning and content marketing process. And we have actually, I've seen that once, I think, in Cambridge, certainly. Right, what else have we got? A question from Howard. Do the coaches, another question, do the coaches ever collaborate to solve problems, or do different offices do so? Does that make sense? Yeah. That's
a very good question. So one of the potential downsides of having lots of independent self-managing teams is that perhaps that connection, that being part of a wider organization and that learning that normally comes from that would lack, would be absent. And how, so the question is, how have Buurtzorg addressed that? And they've addressed it in various ways. One very important element that forms the glue in Buurtzorg is their technology. They have an intranet type system called Buurtzorg Web, and that is partly used to record their normal care activities, but it's also largely there to support the teams and the individuals to share, to learn, and to communicate. So partly it's a discussion tool. Certain teams might say, hey, we've tried this out, it worked fantastically well, but we've got some questions about X, Y, Z. What do other teams think? And basically that creates various dialogues that allows the teams to learn. Secondly, there is a system of specialism. So in most teams, the individual care professionals develop certain specialisms over time through training and through their personal interests. For instance, one might be more specialized in dementia care, another person might be specialized more in end-of-life care. And if you as a team have a particular issue, you can look for other teams and find out which specialisms are in your area that you can call upon. So if you have a particular dementia issue with the patient that you're struggling with, then you can find on the web very quickly in a nearby team of specialists who you can contact and ask the question, and sometimes even bring over to see the patient with you. Also, the coaches get together quite regularly, I think every 6 to 8 weeks, to share what's going on in the organization, both mood-wise or content-wise, what issues the organization is grappling with. And clearly in the COVID times, there were lots of these issues that overflowed in the organization. And also the teams and all the employees get together every so often through a range of conferences that Buurtzorg physically holds throughout the country once a year, although in COVID times, of course, that has had to be done in an online way rather than in a physical way.
I've got I've got another question. There's another couple of questions actually below this. Sharon Allen says, are there any successful replications of Buurtzorg in the UK? I know there have been several attempts, but not sure if any have succeeded. What do you think leads to this or not?
Yeah, well, that's a great bridge to the next part of the presentation. Because you're right, there have been quite a lot of organizations that have been interested in the model, charmed by these fantastic outcomes. To be 40%, Buurtzorg proved to be about 40% cheaper than a typical care organization in the UK, and where a lot of other care organizations really struggled to recruit new staff and to hold on to their existing staff. Buurtzorg saw the reverse. They saw a surge of employees, of care professionals, of nurses, knocking on their door saying, hey, we don't have a Buurtzorg team in our neighborhood. Can we start one? We would love to work in this way. Because it aligns with our purpose. This is why we came into care in the first place, and we would love to join you. And as I said, that attracted attention from all over the world, also in the UK. And we started working here in the UK in a consultancy capacity with parts of the NHS, with local authorities, but also with other independent organizations, to see what the learnings were from that and how they could implement some of these lessons. And that's been a very interesting journey. And later on, I will reflect on some of the general points that came out of that. But more importantly, I think what we saw in a couple of those initiatives where organizations, with our help, set up a couple of teams, brought a coach in, or we supplied the coach, created, gave the training to the teams and the support that they needed in order to work in a self-managed manner. We learned a couple of things. One thing that we learned was that this care model that is at the heart of Buurtzorg, about empowering the patient and helping them to regain their independence and working with their social network, their informal network, to help create a support solution, works also fantastically well in the UK. And we've seen some fantastic outcomes where patients have been stuck in a rut for years, and within a couple of months being supported in this manner, really improved dramatically and actually could be discharged. We also saw that this way of working amongst care professionals with the right support also works extremely well in the UK. Often I get asked, well, this will only work in the Netherlands because the Dutch are more black and white and straightforward, and they can deal with these responsibilities and tell each other, what to do or what to stop doing, and that wouldn't work in the UK. Well, I can assure you that with the right support, we have seen that these care professionals in the UK can also work in this manner, and generally, a few exceptions notwithstanding, generally also love working in this way and really take ownership of a relatively small group of clients, of patients. What we also learned was actually that doing this in the context of a highly hierarchical organization with a history of command and control that's unparalleled, and whilst this larger organization is still delivering many other services in their traditional and trusted manner, and for all, in their perspective, and why not, for all the right reasons, that is where the clash really begins to hurt. A traditional hierarchical organization doesn't really know well how to work with a self-managing part of an organization, because these teams require a very different type of support. There, the teams don't want to be told what to do or be given, this is your new performance appraisal template, or can you just send me this report, that report, and such report. No, these teams ultimately want to find their own way and make their own decisions, but the rest of the organization doesn't know better. So this is where initially the friction occurs. And secondly, we also see the behaviors from the leadership in those organizations, of course, to be their normal leadership behavior, not one necessarily and naturally one of great trust and empowerment. And behaviors are such an important symbol, and when you try to introduce such different ways of working, that if you don't start with the right behaviors at the top, that at some point or another, this self-managing bubble, as it were, in your organization will pick up on that and will really find that actually it feels that it's not understood. And that comes to a head most often when there is an issue, when there is a problem. And problems will occur, events happen, stuff happens. So when we saw in a pilot that they did something wrong or something went wrong or whatever happened, if management supported that with great levels of trust and accepted that this was a moment of learning and that the team were allowed to find their way through this, then the pilots would strengthen and would indeed become more successful. But we saw more often that the organization knee-jerked into their normal behavior, which was, okay, well, this clearly doesn't work. We need to write more procedures to make this clear. We need to put more control around this team. And that, of course, threw the baby away with the bathwater. So, in short, therefore, the answer to your question is, has it been successful? Not yet. It is still very much in progress.
We've got a few more questions, but I'm conscious that it's, what time is it? It's nearly 22, so I could park them for a bit, or we could address them now. I don't mind which.
Yeah, shall we do the next poll question on the main hurdle for you or your organization?
Okay, and I haven't forgotten all your questions, everybody, and we'll try and come to those at the end. Right, so next poll question about to come up. Okay. Filling in the answers. It's quite interesting to see live polling, which of course I'm the only one who can see, but it looks like it's such a clear thing when it starts off and then it all kind of meshes together. Keeps me happy anyway. Right then, how are we doing? Nearly, has everybody voted? Nearly, you're getting there. Okay, let's end that. I think that's, here we go. Here are the results.
Wow, that's a pretty clear vote.
Yes, I thought absence of trust was going to win initially.
Yes, well, that's a great bridge. Thank you, Louise. Let's then move on to what are success factors to do this well. If you are ambitious enough to transform your organization or to build your organization, as some of you are probably on the cusp of this organizational size where you have to make a decision where you're heading. Are you heading towards the traffic light model, or are you heading towards the roundabout model? And so then it's important, I think, to have some of these things in the back of your mind when you are looking at self-managed organizations and see what you can learn from them. And what we learned, and especially what I learned from my work with Buurtzorg here in the UK, is that it's really important to make the model your own. So it is tempting to pick and mix, to copy elements of other organizations and expect the same outcomes. But if you haven't really thought through why you're doing this and how you hope that this will make your product or your service much better aligned with what your clients need, then I think you will struggle, as we sometimes were struggling with some of our Buurtzorg clients. It's also important to realize that this is not from A to B transformation. You have to accept that B is probably very nebulous. So you have to start with the journey, accepting that you're going to be learning as you go along, and that it's actually largely in the hands of your frontline workers that you're going to be working with to design this model, what works for them, that will ultimately result in if there is ever an end model, the model of organizing and the model of delivering your service as it evolves. And there it's really important that you start with the right behaviors in your process of change that underpin the kind of behaviors that you hope to ingrain in the organization going forward. Now, what I mean by that is that it is not a good idea to, for instance, go away in an ivory tower, design what this new organization will look like in great levels of detail, and announce to the rest of the organization that from tomorrow, this is how you're going to be working. No, it is important, if you want an organization to be open, if you want to display levels of trust, if you want to have frank feedback, that you build your change process with that DNA already in place. And the role of the leader in this is absolutely crucial. So you can sort of, in the Netflix story and also in the Buurtzorg story, the founders are absolutely essential in espousing those values and behaviors. And you can imagine that if Reed Hastings at Netflix was unaccepted of feedback and would chop your head off if you said something that he didn't like, then clearly that would have been the end of his concept of candor. And if Jos Blok was constantly trying to tell teams what to do, then clearly that wouldn't have worked either. So it is really important that the role of the leader or the wider leadership is in line with the behaviors and the principles that you're trying to espouse. And I think I already reflected on our lessons here in the UK that self-management inside or next to a command and control type hierarchical organization is really, really difficult to make work. And I've actually come to the conclusion that you're probably better off that if you have a service in a larger organization in which you want to establish this, you try and hive off this service first and really give it the full tools, the full freedom to experiment with this so that it doesn't get held back by the rest of the organization. Well, start small, accept that you're going to be learning, accept that you're going to be making mistakes, accept that you have to unlearn some of your behaviors, and accept also that the role of the manager is not the manager doesn't necessarily disappear. Buurtzorg is an extreme case, one manager with 14,000 employees. But in many self-managing organizations, the role of the manager has changed. It has changed from a command of control nature to a serve and support and setting context nature. And I think that's really important that you bring that in as part of the transformation process. Now, I use a little bit of a framework when I go through this, and as you may have picked up by now, I often start with really clarifying the purpose. As we saw with Buurtzorg, what is your vision of good care? And if your vision of good care is such that it would be helped by creating some sort of self-managed model, what does that model then really need to look like? Are you clear on what you're trying to achieve with that? And it needs to be in tune with your beliefs, right? Because if you actually don't believe that employees can be trusted, then there is no point in really going down this route at all. And once you have established that, ask yourself, but more importantly, also ask your front line and work with your front line and ask your clients, what does a good product or service really look like? What is currently hampering you in delivering that good product or that great service? And start to translate that in physical changes, whether that's bringing your teams together in a different way. And by that I mean not just having the software developers in one side and the debuggers on one side, but actually perhaps mixing them up or organizing them in a client-aligned fashion, or whatever you have learned from your exercises by investigating this in your organization. Start to really make some of those physical translations. And sometimes that means that initially they might feel a bit artificial and a bit symbolic, but they are absolutely going to be very helpful in creating this new way of working and creating this new culture. It's interesting to read a book called Team of Teams by an American general who explained how he completely changed how the different parts of the army and the secret services only started working together and sharing information when he brought the command center into one space and letting people all in on everything that was happening. So that physical change actually was a very important symbol to facilitate this much more open way of working together. And then, for instance, you might look in, okay, so if I want to go for a different team structure, what tools do these teams need? how can we best shape them, how can we give them the safety to make their own decisions and learn from some of their mistakes, how can we give them the safety of setting some boundaries so that they understand that self-managing is not anarchy, that there is a clear understanding of what we are asking as an organization of these teams, and also what kind of support these teams can expect from us in return. Help them with decision making, give them other tools around information technology and things like that. Now this tool, I've just given you a flavor for the different aspects, and you can enter some of these questions from any bubble in the tool as far as I'm concerned. But it's interesting to realize that once you start in one point, you'll quickly begin to notice that these other concepts, these other aspects become relevant as well. So maybe this is a good time to ask if there are any further questions around, especially this point of transformation.
Yes, we've had some others. Now there was one. Oh, where was it? There was a very good question. Another question from Sasha. How does this type of organisation control costs against available capital or cash flow? Is everyone required to pay for themselves? At the extreme, is there a risk to lead to a form of Uberization of work?
I didn't quite get that last bit. Is there a risk?
Is there a risk leading to a form of Uberization, like the organisation Uber, of work?
Oh, yes, very good question, actually. But it's a good question, and the allocation of resources is an important question, because that is, of course, one of what traditionally we see as a manager's task and senior manager's tasks in resource allocation. So when you approach, I think, that question for your particular organization, it's important to work that through and find what works for you. There are self-managing organizations, like, for instance, Netflix, that say, well, there is a budget within your department, and you'll be given a budget, but if you want to spend it all on one particular thing that you're absolutely convinced will make a massive leap forward for our organization, or if you want to scatter it over 1,001 smaller initiatives, that's your decision. You're accountable. You can make the decision as you see fit. So clearly, they've decided we have some sort of a budget allocation, but it's at a very high level. And next to that, we simply give the context of where we want the organization to go, where we believe that our strengths should lie in 1, 5, 10 years from today, and go ahead in figuring out what that means for your part of the organization. In other organizations, such as Buurtzorg, they have actually, of course, it's a very different nature. It's not a highly capitalized of service, a care organization. 80% of the costs are people in the end. But in Buurtzorg, they've really simplified it for the teams. So rather than giving them a profit and loss to manage, they essentially said, look, we want you to generate sufficient income, and in the Netherlands, care organizations derive their income from, claim it essentially from insurance. As an insurance-based health system. But if 60% of your time is billable, then we will break even, and that's good enough for us. We will break even with a sufficient cushion to invest in the future, etc. So rather than asking teams to manage complicated profit and loss, they say, okay, you can manage your team. You can be as large as 12 maximum, so make sure that you don't exceed that, but and try and hit that 60% productivity level, then we are happy. So they've clearly made that translation to keep it simple and clear for the front line. There are other organizations that go even further, that go much further than this to the other side, and where the pendulum swings to the other side. There are organizations where employees can make massive multi-million-pound decisions on creating making big capital investments, as long as they as long as they follow a process, what is generally called the advice process, as long as they have asked the opinion of various people that might be affected or have useful information about this particular possible decision, they are allowed to make that decision themselves. Now, clearly, that is that's a super high trust environment that these individuals will be working in. And what you need to figure out for your organization is, okay, what environment do I work in, and what would work well for our organization? What are we comfortable with? And what really makes sense for our frontline to take on.
That actually leads nicely into a question that was asked a few minutes, or about 20 minutes ago, from Ben. Basically, he is saying, what sorts of rules and policies do you think you need in a self-managed organisation? I found we need to agree rules and write them down in a policy to run a company within the law and achieve the right culture of peer review. How does that kind of fit with your last point?
That's a great point. So my first answer to the question would be, well, try and have as few policies and procedures as possible. One of the principles that we use a lot in the Buurtzorg context is work with your teams on the basis of a very simple framework, and I'd rather call it a commitment agreement, in which it's very clear what the team commits to the organization and what the organization commits to the team, of which one of the defining principles, of course, is, well, stay within the law. But others involved were involved with how the opening hours, for instance, of your service, and that you were trying to hit that 60% target, for instance. There are clearly process and procedures that sometimes are helpful, but we do have a tendency to create policies and procedures that, from the perspective of the policymaker, are helpful, but from the perspective of the front line, are not helpful at all. And I think to instill in your organization a practice that says, well, okay, this rule that I'm now trying to instill on the rest of the organization, how does this help the front line delivering a better service or a better product? That is a very, very important question to keep asking yourself. And Buurtzorg have been extremely good at that, and they've simplified their policies and procedures and their back office processes as a result dramatically, and that's why they can serve a whole organization with only a handful of people. But I've seen many organizations where policies and procedures, of course, with the best will in the world, with the best intentions, have gone completely overboard. I've seen policies on how to open a window, or what to do when you have a flat tire. Now, clearly, that's not quite in line with treating people like grown-ups and trusting the professional to do the right thing. So really think through when you're creating, when you're establishing your policies and procedures. One word on the law and also on regulation, because some of our organizations, of course, operate in a highly regulated market. And you want to, when establishing this new way of working, you sometimes find that you're actually doing things simply because the regulator asks you to. And sometimes that's inevitable, and maybe you can charge your back office to deal with that without bothering the front line too much with it. And sometimes it might actually interfere with your vision of what a good service looks like. And then you have a bigger problem at hand. And then it's interesting to see what you can actually do by working with the regulator. And what we did a lot in the Netherlands and also in the UK was actually engage with the regulator and find out where they were coming from with their regulations and share where we were coming from, and then try and find a way that allowed us to both learn from different ways of working. And actually we found that to be highly productive and highly creative as well. So I think it's important to realize that laws and rules and regulations are also made by people, and that of course they also gain insights as they go
along. I'm conscious of the time, actually. I think it's 11:55. We've got another couple of really good questions, but I know that you've still got a bit to cover. How do you want to play that? Should we do your last bit? If people are willing to hang on, hopefully we can get to the questions.
You want to do the poll?
Should we do the poll? The poll is coming.
Very quickly.
Quick poll, people. Okay. read the questions. It's good. Okay, votes are coming in. Okay, I think we're nearly there. Right, let's end that and share the results. There you go.
Oh, great! There's quite an even even interest along the lines. Thank you. If you're considering looking into this further, I think it's first and foremost it's helpful to do a bit of a readiness check, and I've just shared my dartboard of readiness, as I call it. That helps you make a very quick assessment to see, okay, of these different aspects that play a role in introducing some of the self-management principles, you know, and what kind of challenge or what kind of task may I find myself, and you can very simply fill in this spider web diagram and see where your strengths and weaknesses might lie. It doesn't mean that, for instance, if you have, some of you already indicated that your leadership might be a struggle, that it's a no-goer, but it means certainly that that's an area that you have to give an awful lot of attention to in order to make this successful. But perhaps you can already build on the fact that you're a small, nimble organization with people who are already quite professional and are used to high levels of trust. So work on the stuff that work on the strengths, but also be aware of the weaknesses of your starting point. And then be aware of what it is that you really try to achieve. Are you going for the full transformation? Or perhaps you think of, well, you know, let's start with something gently, maybe work with the team on improving their effectiveness around decision making or working remotely, using some of the self-managed principles. And if that lands well, we can always see whether we can take a step further. And then get inspired. Look at so many other organizations. I've shared 2 with you today. There are fantastically rich books out there, and I will send you a bit of a recommended list of reading with the presentation afterwards. Get inspired, listen to those organizations, but avoid the trap of trying to copy them. Certainly whole scale, but use the things that you think might work and start and learn. Basically, start small, start with the willing, be prepared to make some mistakes and learn as you go along. To conclude, if you're interested in taking this further, do contact me. I'm setting up a group in which organizations will be represented that are going to try this out. And what we will cover in this group is a couple of topics that are generally really important to getting this right. So we will give you expert support in this group, but you will also support each other through your learning as you go along on this journey. The experts on the team are myself and my colleague Tanya Eber, who is an experienced team coach, has done lots of work with various organizations in the UK. So if you're interested, please drop me a line. The contact details are going to be shared with you now. So thank you very much for joining us this morning. I think I've used up all of my time. There was 1,001 other things that I would have liked to have said, but for that we'll need to do it in a different way.
Thank you very much. I mean, just the amount of content there was fantastic, and yeah, there's some thanks coming in on the chat as well, and I'm sorry we didn't get around to all of the questions. There were some excellent questions there as well, but maybe you'll have to ask those of Paul direct, I think. You timed it beautifully down to the minute. That's very impressive. But yeah, some of the comments, in case you can't see, they're really insightful. Thank you very much. Thanks, Paul. That was great. Thank you. That was a brilliant session. This has been hugely refreshing and a great prompt to explore. Thanks, Paul and the group. Yeah, so yeah, we've had some brilliant comments. So thank you very much, everybody. And I'm sorry we didn't get around to asking all of your questions. Yeah, we're fantastic. I ignored the bits about the roundabouts at the front. So thank you, Paul. That was brilliant. I can probably download some of this chat so you can have a look at it afterwards as well, so you can see what people have said, rather than me just reading out a few things. But thank you very much. As Paul says, we'll send around the presentation and the resources There was, I noticed, I think it was Sasha, who also shared a PDF document, and I can download that and share that as well if I can work out how to do it. Yep. So I'll share that as well and let Paul know that that's what you've shared. So thank you very much. Brilliant session. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye. Thanks, Paul.
Ah, try that.